But I remember my mother receiving a phone call from whomever Elvis had employed to call people, whatever, and saying that he wanted the Sweets back to do his comeback show in Vegas.
When Whitney Houston mentioned Elvis Presley, it wasn't admiration, it was revelation. She said his name once in an interview that few people ever saw, and the moment she did, the room changed. Her tone shifted, her eyes softened, and what came next left the interviewer frozen, because Whitney didn't talk about Elvis like a fan. She talked about him like someone who understood his soul. It wasn't a random connection. Whitney grew up in the church, the daughter of gospel royalty, raised under the sound of choir robes, brushing against wooden pews, harmonies echoing off stained glass. Sunday mornings weren't performances, they were confessions. That was her foundation. Purity, reverence, and fire. And deep inside that rhythm and ache, she found her voice. But there was one name she wasn't supposed to say out loud: Elvis Presley. In the Houston household, Elvis was complicated. For many in her community, he was the man who took what black artists created, gospel, soul, rhythm, and turned it into a white man's sound. Whitney's uncles and aunts said he didn't grow up with their struggle, their pain, their roots. But Whitney didn't see him that way. She saw something else, something tragic, something familiar. In her private circles, Whitney admitted she felt Elvis's voice differently than anyone else. "You can't fake that," she once told a friend. "That hurt, that hunger, that's not an act." She believed that Elvis didn't steal black music. He carried it. Maybe clumsily, maybe imperfectly, but with sincerity that few understood, and that honesty moved her. By the mid-1980s, when Whitney became the new face of pop perfection, she was being compared to everyone: Aretha, Diana, even Michael. But she once said quietly to a sound engineer, "They never compare me to Elvis, maybe, because they know I'd understand him too much." He laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Because as her fame exploded, Whitney began to feel something she couldn't name: the isolation, the control, the whispers, the fake smiles, the pressure to be flawless every time she opened her mouth. Elvis had lived it before her. He had smiled for the cameras while dying inside. Years later, in 1993, during a quiet interview in London, Whitney finally broke her silence. The interviewer asked a casual question: "Who inspired you most growing up?" She smiled politely and named Mahalia Jackson, Aretha Franklin, and her mother. Then she paused. The room went still. And she said, almost under her breath, "You know who nobody ever lets me say? Elvis Presley." The journalist blinked, unsure if he heard right. Whitney leaned forward, her voice soft but fierce. "He was the first white man who sang like he'd been to church with us," she said, "and he paid the price for it." Her team tried to redirect the conversation, but Whitney wasn't done. She said Elvis didn't just imitate gospel, he lived through the same contradictions the church warned her about: temptation and redemption, glory and guilt, holiness and hunger. She described him as a man torn between grace and fame, the same way she often felt. "They both said we had everything," she whispered, "but they didn't see what it cost." When the interview aired, that segment never made it to television. The network cut it out, claiming it didn't fit the format. But those who were there remembered the look in her eyes. She wasn't talking about a legend. She was confessing something. Some say that tape was destroyed. Others say a copy still exists, buried in a private archive. But those who heard her words knew what she meant. Whitney wasn't defending Elvis's legacy. She was recognizing herself in it. The loneliness that comes when the entire world loves your voice, but forgets your heart. And maybe that's why her words about Elvis hit so deep. Because she wasn't just speaking of him. She was warning herself. It was the first and last time Whitney Houston ever spoke his name on record. And what she said next, in a moment so raw her own label tried to erase it, would change how fans saw them both forever. It was late 1993, inside a quiet London studio. Whitney Houston had just wrapped a long press day, the kind of marathon of interviews she'd learned to survive with a perfect smile. The Bodyguard soundtrack had made her a global phenomenon, and the world saw only glamour, sparkle, and control. But behind the curtain, Whitney was unraveling. Her schedule was brutal. Her voice was strained. Her private life was under siege. And that night, something inside her snapped, not in anger, but in truth. When the journalist asked who her greatest influences were, Whitney gave the safe answers first. Her mother, Cissy, Aretha Franklin, Mahalia Jackson. But then she hesitated. It wasn't the hesitation of confusion, it was defiance. She leaned back in her chair and said softly, "You know who nobody ever lets me say? Elvis Presley." The room went silent. The interviewer thought he misheard. Whitney's expression didn't waver. "Yeah," she said, "Elvis, the king." She explained that her grandmother had a stack of his old gospel records. "How Great Thou Art," "Peace in the Valley," "Amazing Grace." Whitney had grown up listening to them on an old turntable that scratched with age, and even then, she could hear something behind the sound. That pain, that plea. You could tell he was singing to survive something, she said. Then she said the line that never aired. He sang like he knew God, but was afraid he'd stopped listening. The producer sitting off camera looked nervous. Whitney wasn't supposed to be this candid. Her PR team had warned her to avoid controversial comparisons, but she kept talking, her tone building like a slow-burning confession. "Elvis," she said, "was the first white man who sang like he'd been to church with us, and he paid the price for it." The journalist leaned forward and asked what she meant. Whitney smiled, not a happy smile, but a sad one. "They used him up," she said. "They took his soul and called it pop. And when he couldn't give them any more, they called him crazy." Her words hung in the air. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished. It was pure emotion. She wasn't talking about Elvis anymore. She was talking through him. She described how she'd watched old footage of him, late at night on her tour bus. The Vegas years, the forced smiles, the heavy eyes. "He looked like a man still trying to make God happy," she said. "And that, I understood." For a moment, her voice cracked. The journalist didn't interrupt. She wiped her eye and laughed it off. "You can't say that, can you?" she said. "They'll cut it out." Elvis's life became a rotation of tours, pills, and promises. Whitney's became interviews, gossip, and expectation. He numbed his pain with prescription bottles. She drowned hers in substances that blurred the edges of her reality. Both were surrounded by people who called themselves family, and both died surrounded by people who couldn't save them. The irony was cruel. They'd both started as voices that could lift souls to heaven, yet fame turned that same gift into the very thing that dragged them down. Elvis sang "How Great Thou Art" with tears streaming down his face. Whitney sang "I Will Always Love You" until her voice cracked under the weight of 1,000 rehearsals. Both were applauded for their perfection, never pitied for their exhaustion. Whitney once told a friend, "I don't sing anymore. I survive songs." Elvis had said something nearly identical to his Memphis Mafia in his final years. "I'm out there to make the crowd happy. Doesn't matter what it's doing to me." Two artists decades apart, speaking the same language of quiet surrender. The parallels didn't stop there. Elvis's manager kept him trapped in Vegas, milking his residency for every dollar, while the man himself was collapsing on stage. Whitney's team kept her on tour, forcing her to perform through illness and heartbreak. When she tried to cancel a show, she was reminded of the contracts, the debts, the obligations. "You owe them," one executive told her. That's when she whispered, "So did Elvis." He had once tried to escape, planning a European tour that Colonel Parker secretly sabotaged because Parker himself was an undocumented immigrant who couldn't leave the U.S. Elvis never knew. He just thought the world didn't want him anymore. Whitney faced the same invisible chains. When she tried to take a break in the late 1990s, her label leaked stories that she was unreliable. It was reputation warfare designed to keep her in line. Both turned to the only place that ever made sense: music. Late at night, Whitney would sit in her home studio and sing old hymns. "His eye is on the sparrow. I love the Lord." Elvis did the same at Graceland, sitting alone at his piano long after everyone else was asleep. One of his staff members once said, he'd start with gospel, always gospel, like he was begging to feel saved again. And in Whitney's final days, she returned to that same longing. Her assistant recalled her humming "You'll Never Walk Alone" the night before she passed. The same hymn Elvis performed at his 1972 show in Vegas, the one where his voice cracked when he reached the line, "Walk on through the wind." Both of them were walking through a storm no one else could see. Elvis was found in his Graceland bathroom, only a few feet from his piano. Whitney was found in a Beverly Hills hotel, only a few feet from the stage where she'd rehearsed for her comeback. Two icons, both alone, both victims of the same beautiful curse, the kind that gives you everything except peace. They both knew the cost of the crown. For Elvis, it was his health. For Whitney, it was her spirit. And though the world mourned them as separate tragedies, their stories were mirrors. Same church, same chords, same heartbreak. In one of her last interviews, Whitney said softly, "I still listen to him sometimes. People forget. He could pray with a song." The interviewer didn't ask who she meant, but her tone said it all. It's almost poetic that Whitney's last public performance was a duet of "Jesus Loves Me," sung just days before her death. The same message Elvis clung to in his final gospel medley. "He loves me, he loves me." When she whispered, "He knew," that night in rehearsal, her team thought she was referring to her band, but those closest to her believed she meant Elvis, a man she'd never met, but had somehow been following all along. Because deep down, Whitney Houston didn't just admire Elvis Presley, she understood him, the fame, the ache, the quiet hunger for grace. And in the end, both of them reached for the same thing: not applause, not headlines, not crowns, just mercy. In the years since Whitney Houston's passing, her words about Elvis Presley have resurfaced like a ghost the industry can't ignore. For decades, fans thought her comment about Elvis was nothing more than rumor, a moment whispered in private, too strange to believe. But as more pieces surfaced, fragments of interviews, testimonies from crew members, sound engineers, the picture became clear Whitney had meant every word. She saw in Elvis a mirror of herself, a legend worshipped for their voice but buried beneath their own myth. And long before her own final curtain, she knew where that path ended. After her death, fans began connecting the dots, the gospel references, the parallels, The way Whitney's final performances seemed to echo Elvis's last years. At a 2011 rehearsal, she sang "Can't Help Falling in Love" softly to herself between takes. The same song Elvis had made immortal, the same melody that once filled his Vegas stage. The crew said it wasn't planned. She just sang it under her breath, eyes closed, as if trying to reach someone. And maybe she was. For Whitney, Elvis represented something forbidden yet familiar. He was the bridge between the sacred and the broken, a man who could touch heaven with his voice but still fall to earth. And she'd come to realize she was living the same contradiction. Both of them were proof that being adored doesn't mean being understood. In the years after Whitney's passing, tributes poured in from artists who admitted they'd never known about her admiration for Elvis. Lisa Marie Presley once said, "If that's true, it doesn't surprise me. My father had a spirit people could feel, and Whitney had that too." It was the first public acknowledgement from the Presley family that the connection was real. It wasn't just musical, it was spiritual. Both Whitney and Elvis wrestled with the same kind of fame that devours faith. They were told they were chosen, touched by something divine, and yet surrounded by voices that worshiped the brand, not the person. It's a strange kind of loneliness, the kind that makes even applause sound hollow. After her passing, one of Whitney's longtime friends found a journal entry she had written years earlier. In it, she mentioned Elvis's name again. "He sang like he was praying for forgiveness," she wrote. "Sometimes I do too." That one line changed everything. Suddenly, her earlier comments weren't just admiration, they were confession. She had recognized in him the same battle between grace and destruction. Fans started digging into old footage, grainy clips, unreleased rehearsals, interviews she'd given, and the ones that never aired. And they noticed something haunting. Whenever she mentioned struggle, faith, or the burden of fame, Elvis's name seemed to linger just beneath the surface. For Whitney, he wasn't just the king. He was a warning, a prophecy about what happens when the gift becomes a chain. And by the time she realized it, she was already too deep to escape it. The tragedy is that both of them were trying to return home, not to Graceland or Newark, but to that small, quiet church inside themselves. The one where the music wasn't a job, the fans weren't watching, and the only applause came from above. Even now, fans say they can feel it when they play their records back to back. Elvis's trembling "How Great Thou Art," Whitney's flawless yet fragile "I Love the Lord." Two souls calling out through time, each trying to find their way back to grace. And maybe that's why Whitney's forgotten interview still matters. It wasn't scandalous. It was sacred. She wasn't talking about a man. She was talking about herself and everyone who ever traded truth for perfection. When she said, "He paid the price for it," she wasn't condemning Elvis. She was predicting her own ending. And when the interviewer asked what she meant, Whitney simply smiled, that tired, knowing smile, and said, "You'll see." She was right. The world did see. And when she left us, it felt like we were losing Elvis all over again. Another light too bright, too fragile, too human. Whitney Houston didn't just speak about Elvis Presley, she spoke through him. And in doing so, she revealed the one truth that still haunts music history, that the same fire that makes legends also consumes them. If you believe Whitney and Elvis were connected by more than fame, by faith, by struggle, by something divine, subscribe and join us. Because their stories aren't just about music, they're about what it means to be human and how even angels can fall when the world demanded